A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
I was reading about the ancient Athenian agora the other day, and it struck me how much our modern digital version has completely flipped the script on what it means to actually have a conversation. In the original agora, you had physical proximity, shared context, and a direct line to the people making decisions. Today, we have more connectivity than at any point in human history, yet it feels like the ability to actually move the needle through government criticism has never been more diluted. It is the great paradox of the digital age. We are louder than ever, but we are also easier to ignore. Today's prompt from Daniel is about the relationship between freedom of expression and the health of democracy, specifically focusing on the freedom to criticize the government. Given everything that has happened in the last few months, it is a fascinating and frankly urgent timing for this topic.
Herman Poppleberry here, and I have been deep in the digital archives and policy papers on this one. It is a classic paradox that political scientists are calling the visibility trap. In the old days, the barrier to dissent was physical or legal. You either could not get a printing press, or the king would throw you in a dungeon for the pamphlet you wrote. This oppression was overt and easy to identify. Now, the barrier is informational and architectural. You can say whatever you want, you can post it to 1 billion people, but if the algorithm decides your critique is low engagement or doesn't fit the current narrative, you are essentially shouting into a vacuum. You have the right to speak, but you no longer have the right to be heard, and in a democracy, those two things are supposed to be linked.
It is like we have traded the dungeon for the void. One is a cage of stone, the other is a cage of code. But before we get too deep into the digital weeds, let's frame this properly for the listeners. Is the ability to criticize the government just a nice-to-have feature of a free society, like a luxury upgrade on a car? Or is it actually the engine that keeps the whole thing from crashing?
It is the diagnostic tool, corn. It is absolutely foundational. Think of a democratic system like a high-performance engine. Criticism is the sensor array. If you have a sensor telling you the engine is overheating, that is not an attack on the engine. It is the only way you know to fix the cooling system before the whole thing melts down. When a government suppresses dissent, whether through laws or through algorithmic manipulation, they are essentially cutting the wires to their own sensors. They might feel better in the short term because the red light stopped flashing and the dashboard looks clean, but they are flying blind. A government that cannot be criticized is a government that cannot learn from its mistakes, and a government that cannot learn is a government that is destined to fail.
That is a great analogy, but there is a distinction we need to make here between the legal right to free speech and what I would call effective dissent. In the United States, we have the First Amendment, which is arguably the strongest protection of speech in the world. But having the legal right to speak and having a system that actually processes that feedback are two very different things. We are seeing a shift where the legal protections remain, but the systemic utility of that speech is being eroded.
You are touching on the core of the systemic requirement. A healthy democracy requires a feedback loop that actually functions. If I criticize a policy and that criticism is heard, debated, and potentially leads to a change, the loop is closed. The system has self-corrected. But what we are seeing now is a massive breakdown in that loop. We have the legal right to express ourselves, but the technical architecture of our discourse is designed to prioritize outrage over actual policy correction. The platforms where we discuss government policy are not designed for democratic health. They are designed for time on device, and those two goals are often in direct opposition.
Let's talk about that technical architecture, because I think people see the noise on social media and think, well, everyone is criticizing the government all the time, so democracy must be doing great. There are millions of posts every day calling out politicians. But is it actually high signal? We are seeing this noise, the signal problem, where substantive, high-quality critique gets buried under a mountain of low-effort dunking and manufactured outrage. It feels like the volume is turned up to 11, but the actual information content is near zero.
That is by design, or at least it is a predictable byproduct of the incentive structures. As of February 2026, over 64% of global internet traffic is mediated by just 4 major recommendation algorithms. Think about the sheer power that gives those 4 systems. They aren't just reflecting reality, they are curating the boundaries of what is considered a valid or visible critique. If a critique is too complex, if it requires reading a 50-page white paper, or if it doesn't immediately trigger a binary emotional response, the algorithm treats it as friction. And the goal of these platforms is to remove friction to keep you scrolling. They want smooth, easy-to-digest content that keeps the dopamine hitting.
So if I write a 3,000-word breakdown of why a specific tax policy or a geopolitical move in the Middle East is flawed, the algorithm sees that as a boring wall of text. It is friction. It might be the most important critique of the year, but it gets zero reach. But if I post a 10-second clip of a politician stumbling over a word or making a funny face, that goes viral. One is a diagnostic sensor reading, the other is just static. But the system rewards the static.
And that static is actually useful for people in power. There is this concept of censorship through noise. You don't have to ban the dissent if you can just drown it out with a million irrelevant distractions. It is the digital version of a filibuster. If the public square is filled with people arguing about a politician's suit or a celebrity's tweet, they aren't looking at the massive corruption in the procurement office. We saw this play out with the January 2026 Platform Integrity Act. One of the big debates there was about transparency and how these algorithms actually handle political content. The researchers were finding that substantive policy critiques were being suppressed not because they were banned, but because they had a low predicted engagement score.
I remember the rollout of that act. It was supposed to pull back the curtain on how moderation actually works, right? It was pitched as a way to give the public some oversight into the digital gatekeepers. But the implementation has been incredibly messy.
It has been a huge shift, though. For the first time, large-scale platforms are mandated to provide public API access to their moderation logs and their amplification metrics. We are finally seeing the data on what gets suppressed and why. But what the data is showing is even more concerning than we thought. A lot of the suppression isn't even about content. It is about reach. They aren't deleting the dissent. They are just turning the volume down to 0. They call it shadow banning, but it is more like algorithmic containment. If you post something that the system deems divisive or low engagement, it only shows it to people who already agree with you. You are in a digital padded cell where you can scream all you want, but the sound doesn't leave the room.
It feels like a way to maintain the illusion of free speech while neutralizing its effects. It is the ultimate pressure release valve for a government. If I can say whatever I want, but no one can hear me, do I really have freedom of expression in any meaningful sense? It is like being allowed to protest in a soundproof room in the middle of a desert. You feel like you are participating, but you are actually just being managed.
There is also the issue of context collapse, which I find particularly damaging to political discourse. In a healthy democracy, you need different levels of conversation. You need the high-level policy debate, you need the technical expertise, and you need the grassroots reaction. But social media flattens everything into a single feed. A nuanced critique of, say, our support for Israel or our trade policy with China gets dropped into the same feed as a meme about a cat or a video of someone falling over. The nuance is stripped away because the platform isn't built for it. You can't explain the complexities of international law in a format designed for quick hits.
And when nuance dies, polarization takes over. You can't have a productive criticism of the government if every critique is immediately interpreted as a sign of tribal loyalty. If I criticize the current administration on a specific point, half the internet assumes I am a secret agent for the other side, and the other half tries to recruit me. The actual substance of the critique gets lost in the battle for narrative dominance. It becomes about who said it and which team they are on, rather than whether the point they are making is actually true or useful.
It is a massive problem for government accountability. If the public cannot agree on basic facts because the information ecosystem is so fragmented and tribal, then criticism loses its bite. We covered some of the geopolitical aspects of this in episode 860 when we talked about the rise of the strongman era. Governments are getting very good at exploiting this fragmentation. They don't need to control the media anymore, they just need to control the narrative. They use computational propaganda to simulate grassroots support, effectively gaslighting their own citizens.
That is the part that really bothers me. The idea that a government can use AI to generate thousands of fake personas that all agree with a controversial policy. It makes the real dissent look like a fringe opinion. If you are a regular person looking at your feed and you see 10,000 people praising a new law that you think is terrible, you are much less likely to speak up. You start to doubt your own judgment. You think, maybe I am the one who is wrong. This is the spiral of silence, but accelerated by artificial intelligence.
That leads directly into the second order effect of self-censorship. It is a rational response to a hostile environment. If you know that criticizing the government will lead to you being doxxed, harassed by bots, or potentially flagged by a sentiment analysis, AI, you just stop doing it. You don't need a secret police if you can make the digital environment uncomfortable enough that people just police themselves. We are seeing this in the data from the 2025 digital sovereignty initiatives in the European Union. They were trying to protect independent journalism and create a safer digital space, but the unintended consequence was that the regulations made it easier for governments to define what counts as misinformation.
That is the danger of giving any entity, whether it is a tech company or a government, the power to be the arbiter of truth. Once you have the infrastructure to ban lies, it is only a matter of time before that infrastructure is used to ban inconvenient truths. This is why the freedom to criticize the government has to be absolute, even when the criticism is wrong or annoying. The risk of suppressing it is always higher than the risk of letting it exist. If you give the government a scalpel to cut out the cancer of misinformation, don't be surprised when they use it to cut out the heart of the opposition.
The legacy media used to act as gatekeepers, and we criticized them for it for decades. We talked about their biases and their corporate interests, but at least they were human gatekeepers with some level of professional standards and accountability. You could point to an editor and say, "You made this choice." Now the gatekeepers are black box algorithms that no one fully understands, not even the people who wrote them. We have traded a flawed human system for a flawed mathematical one that prioritizes engagement metrics over democratic health. The algorithm doesn't care about the truth, it cares about the click.
So where does that leave us? If the major platforms are compromised by their own business models and governments are learning how to weaponize the noise, is there any room left for effective dissent? How do we rebuild the feedback loop?
This is where I get a bit optimistic about decentralized protocols. We are seeing things like Nostr and ActivityPub gain real traction among people who are serious about political discourse. The idea is to move away from these centralized silos where a single algorithm controls the flow of information. On a decentralized network, there is no central kill switch. There is no single algorithm that can shadow ban a political movement. It is a return to a more peer-to-peer form of communication, much more like the original intent of the internet.
But isn't the downside of decentralization that it becomes even harder to reach a broad audience? If everyone is on their own little private server or their own niche protocol, the public square is essentially gone. We just have a bunch of private living rooms. How do you build a mass movement if you can't reach the masses?
You are right about the trade-off. It is a choice between a public square that is rigged or a series of private rooms that are safe. But maybe the answer is a hybrid model. Use the decentralized tools for the high signal, substantive organizing and critique, and use the big platforms for the broader reach, while being fully aware of how you are being manipulated. It is about being a savvy operator in a hostile environment. We have to treat our digital tools with the same skepticism we treat a politician's campaign speech.
It requires a level of digital literacy that I'm not sure most people have or even want to develop. Most people just want to check their phone and see what is happening. They don't want to manage their own cryptographic keys or navigate a decentralized feed just to post a critique of the local school board. We are asking a lot of the average citizen.
Digital resilience is going to be the defining skill of the next decade. If you care about democracy, you have to care about the tools you use to participate in it. You can't outsource your information diet to a company whose primary goal is to sell your attention to the highest bidder. We actually touched on the legal side of this in episode 876 when we discussed the global battle over free speech. The legal protections are only half the battle. The other half is the technical ability to actually speak and be heard. If the technology is stacked against you, the law is just a piece of paper.
I think one of the most practical things people can do right now is to intentionally diversify their information diet. Get off the algorithmic feed. Find specific writers, journalists, and thinkers you trust, and go directly to their sources. Whether that is a newsletter, a specific website, or a decentralized feed. Break the habit of letting the algorithm decide what is important. It is like moving from a fast food diet to a home-cooked one. It takes more effort, but it is the only way to stay healthy.
And we need to push for real algorithmic auditing. The Platform Integrity Act was a start, but we need to go further. We need to treat these major recommendation engines like public utilities. If they are going to mediate 64% of our discourse, they shouldn't be allowed to hide their bias behind trade secret protections. We should be able to see exactly why a particular piece of government criticism was suppressed or amplified. We need a Freedom of Information Act for the algorithms.
It is funny how we always end up back at transparency. It is the universal solvent for government overreach. If they can't hide what they are doing, it is much harder for them to do it. But that applies to the tech companies too. They are effectively a shadow government when it comes to freedom of expression. They set the rules of the room, and the rules of the room dictate the conversation.
They are the architects of the environment where the government operates. If the architect builds a room where only one person can be heard at a time, it doesn't matter how much you believe in free speech. The room itself dictates the outcome. We need to start looking at the code as a form of law. If the code says your dissent is invisible, then for all practical purposes, you don't have freedom of expression. This is why the open source movement is so important. We need to be able to inspect the code that governs our speech.
That is a chilling thought. Code is law. And if the code is written by people who are either in bed with the government or just afraid of them, then our democratic foundations are a lot shakier than we like to admit. We are building our democracy on top of a proprietary stack that we don't control.
It is why I keep coming back to the importance of open source and decentralized tech. It is not just for nerds anymore. It is a democratic necessity. If we don't own the tools of our communication, we don't really own our speech. We are just tenants in someone else's digital empire, and the landlord can evict our ideas whenever they become inconvenient.
I wonder how this plays out with the rise of AI agents. If everyone has a personal AI that is curating their information for them, does that make the problem better or worse? My AI might be great at filtering out the noise, but it might also be creating an even more perfect echo chamber for me. It might be protecting me from the very critiques I need to hear.
That is the next frontier. AI-driven sentiment analysis is already being used by governments to predict and preempt dissent. They can see the patterns before the people even realize they are angry. But on the flip side, individuals can use AI to identify when they are being manipulated by computational propaganda. It is an arms race. The question is whether the defensive tools can keep up with the offensive ones. Can we build an AI that helps us be better citizens? Or will we just build AIs that make us more efficient consumers of propaganda?
It feels like we are in a transition period, where the old rules of the game don't apply, but the new ones haven't been fully established yet. We are still trying to use 18th century concepts of free speech in a 21st century algorithmic environment. The friction between those two things is where all the tension is right now. We are trying to fix a digital engine with a physical wrench.
And that tension is where the work happens. We can't just give up on the public square because it is messy and manipulated. We have to fight for it. That means demanding transparency, supporting independent media, and being willing to step outside our comfort zones to engage with ideas that the algorithm might be trying to hide from us. It means being an active participant in the feedback loop instead of just a passive observer.
I think a good takeaway for everyone listening is to do a quick audit of how you get your news. If you are getting it all from a single feed, you are essentially letting a black box decide your political worldview. Try to find one source today that challenges your assumptions about a current government policy, not just an angry counterpoint, but a substantive high-signal critique. Look for the senses that are actually reading the engine temperature, not just the ones that are flashing pretty lights.
It is about becoming an active participant instead of a passive consumer. Democracy isn't something that just happens to you, it is something you have to actively maintain, and that maintenance starts with protecting the feedback loops. If the sensors are broken, you have to fix them. If the wires are cut, you have to splice them back together.
Well, this has been a deep dive into some pretty heavy territory, but I think it is essential. If we can't criticize the government effectively, we are just waiting for the engine to blow up. And by the time the smoke starts coming out of the hood, it is usually too late to fix the problem.
I am glad Daniel sent this one in. It is one of those topics that feels like it should be simple, but the more you peel back the layers, the more you realize how much the technical infrastructure is actually driving the outcome. We think we are in control of our thoughts, but we are often just responding to the environment we are placed in.
It is the invisible architecture of our lives. We don't notice it until it starts pushing us in directions we don't want to go, and by then the momentum is hard to stop.
So let's pay attention now. Let's look at the code, look at the algorithms, and look at the feedback loops.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave everyone with a question. Can democracy actually survive if the public square is privately owned and algorithmically managed? It is something we are going to be grappling with for a long time, and I don't think there is an easy answer.
It is the question of our age.
Big thanks as always to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping us on track and making sure the audio doesn't sound like it's coming from a soundproof room in the desert. And a huge thank you to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show. We couldn't do these deep dives into the technical side of things without that support.
If you found this discussion valuable, we would really appreciate it if you could leave a review on your favorite podcast app. It genuinely helps other people find the show and join the conversation. We need more people in the loop.
You can also find us at myweirdprompts.com for the full archive and all the ways to subscribe. This has been My Weird Prompts. We will see you in the next one.
See you then.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts.